God in heaven, thank you so much for this chance to be together. Thanks that we can talk together and hear from you together. I pray you bless this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kirk.
So if people want to mute, I should say that too.
All right. Well, once again, I've got several questions scattered throughout the presentation. I'm just going to recap on a couple of things. I don't know if there are folks that are joining us this week that were not able to participate last week. And then I'll get back to the question that we left off with. And then I'll take a brief look at Christian beliefs, several Christian beliefs, and how they inform the study of the past. And then we'll wrap up with a call for Christian historians, but I think it's more than a call for Christian historians. I think it's a call for all Christians who are students of the past. So that's just an overview of what I'd like to do today. So in the spirit of recapping, this is a key slide from last week's conversation, acknowledging the messiness of the past, and it is the task of historians to make sense out of the mess. But this done well is grounded in evidence, and that evidence is then shaped into interpretation. Going back to some of the terms that we used last week, the past never changes. That statement may surprise people, but the past is a record of events. But history changes all the time. History is the study of that past, the reconstruction, if you will, of the past, and that takes us right into kind of a collision point in terms of how many in the public view history versus people who practice the craft from a professional standpoint or even a lay but in-depth standpoint. So this is quite obvious when you step back and think about it, that there's new information surfacing all the time when folks are exploring, and that leads to a new historical narrative of what happened. And admittedly, then the history has changed. And the field refers to that as revisionism. And frankly, it's the lifeblood of the historical profession, but we've all heard a number of folks in the public, use the term revisionist history as a criticism. So this is just a critical point to any of these kinds of conversations, to acknowledge up front, not only is that normal, but it is truly kind of the heartbeat of the historical profession and the historical process. So a lot of what I've talked about is based on a book called Why Study History by John Fea, and I talked about the book last week. But John and others, as we'll see this morning, talk about various traits that history can teach us. And you see empathy, humility, selflessness, and hospitality. We're going to talk a little bit more about all four of those. What you don't necessarily see is authority, clarity, which is, I think, a lot of what the public tends to think, that this is a set collection of facts, never to change. And we memorize these, and we know these, and we declare these. And frankly, that's not the historical profession as I know it. So we'll go back to the question that I asked, and Tom and a couple of others of you answered it. The question was, does the church need a history lesson? And Tom, I was struck by your response. It was very, you were very quick to answer, and I think you said not lesson, but lessons. And so I wondered if you and others would, if you'd say a little bit more about why you responded that way, and then we'll look forward to hearing from some other folks.
Yeah.
Kent, you're on mute. I mean, Tom. You're mute.
There he is. Yep.
Remind me again what I said. I mean, the past is past, but
When I asked this question at the end of the session last Sunday,
Right.
you very quickly said we absolutely need a history lesson, and we don't need just one, we need history lessons. And I was struck by how quick you were to weigh in, and particularly from your perspective and your calling and your vocation. I was just really interested to hear more about why you felt so strongly about the church's need for a history lesson.
no, I agree with your question.
While Tom's thinking about that, I would just say I think the biggest thing I realize is how many narratives I've heard wrong, and especially about manifest destiny and the real treatment of Native Americans, how atrocious that was. And that of course informs the church in terms of how we treat people.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't mean to jump on top of you, Chris.
That's okay, I'm done.
I guess I agree with that. I just want to be careful using the word wrong. Maybe the viewpoint isn't paying enough attention to history. And so now we need to like introduce the historical understanding from different perspectives in order for that narrative to change.
Yeah, at the very least, the narratives that many of us grew up with are incomplete.
Right.
And so, but it takes us back to that, those traits that we've talked about. Any other comments on number one? Does a church need a history lesson, and if so, why?
I would like to chime in, and I'd like to agree with Chris and Melissa and everybody else. No, but just those two right now, because I think what Chris and I are finding as we read our way through some of this dialogue on race material is that there's a context that has been missing and a set of voices that have been missing, that when we start to hear them, they set the record, not right, wrong, but in a different way, and a way that we really need to hear and has been undersaid for so long. So that context setting is what I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah.
I still think there is a moral element. If you think killing people is wrong, there's a moral element to the.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really good point, and we're going to talk about kind of moral reflection in just a minute. We also talked about the intersection of current events and history in the past, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that I experienced even since we gathered last week. And one on Friday, I had the privilege to go down to Morton, Minnesota, to the Lower Sioux Agency Historic Site, which is a part of the Minnesota Historical Society site network. And as some of you know, that's where the initial events that led to the U.S.-Dakota War began. And after literally more than a decade worth of work and relationship building and going through bureaucratic hoops, MNHS was able to return 114 acres back to the Lower Sioux Indian community. And it was just a really powerful experience to be a part of that, what in some respects was a real estate closing. Our attorney said, I'll never experience a closing like this before. But what struck me is everybody in the room knew the history. and everybody knew the broken promises, but I was just more than humbled by the graciousness of the Lower Sioux leadership, the tribal council, their president, and it's been this way for years. And so, you know, I feel like I had the privilege to really just kind of live this very profoundly on Friday, and you know, it's frankly one of the highlights of my career. And I didn't have a lot to do with it. I got involved about 2.5 years before we wrapped it up, but others had been involved, as I said, for well over a decade. But what, in many respects, what made it possible was the graciousness of the Lower Sioux Indian community. And so that was a very powerful experience. I don't know if you all happened to notice the op-eds in the Star Tribune as well. I think a few weeks ago, there was one expressing great concern for the removal of key historical events in the social studies curriculum standards, or the call to remove some of those things. And then there was a counter earlier this past week, and you know, the people are headed to their corners, and it's just it's quite disheartening. I think about the graciousness that I experienced, and we need grace to intercede so that social studies curriculum standards experience, you know, can have a, you know, a positive outcome. And then the other thing I read was, some of you guys may follow Chris Gerritz's blog, but he posted on the legacy. Is it R.W. Carlson from Bethel, the professor? And I certainly didn't know that professor, but it was a beautiful tribute 5 years after his death, and it talked about how he managed and navigated differing opinions and the power of love at the end of that. So those were just a few things that I encountered this past week that seemed to align with an awful lot of what we're talking about, and I just encourage you take a look at those things if you haven't yet. It was quite encouraging. All right, well, let's move on.
Excellent.
John Field was one of the guys that called for the church to undergo a history lesson, and here are a couple of comments in terms of why he thinks it would be valuable. You know, he first talked about the virtues that could help end the culture wars, and oh, wouldn't that be a glorious thing? It's certainly a history lesson can transform our ways of thinking about others. Chris, you touched on that, and you know, and he was a little modest, but he said in some small way, you know, the study of history can bring meaningful change to the world. I think it's more than a small way. And then going from a, you know, shifting to a decidedly Christian perspective, he says that, you know, we can become more mature, and it can help us not only to love God, but our neighbor more. So, would like to talk a little bit about four Christian beliefs and you know, how they could influence the study of the past. And before I launch into this, let me just quickly say that Thea and other Christian scholars are quick to point out that you know, they kind of view their call as historians is less about creating Christian historical content, and more about their beliefs informing how they practice the craft of history. And they also take it a step further and say, you know, the study of history is really the study of humanity and less the study of God. And so I think those are a couple of key points that need to be made. But nevertheless, there are clearly Christian beliefs that have been identified, and here are four of them. The whole notion that we are created in God's image. You know, we think of Genesis 1:7, where God created humankind in His image, and him in the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them. You know, I've got to believe that if we look at humanity through God's eyes, and we then are reminded of the dignity and worth of all persons, that may change who we include in the story. You know, whether or not you were a key contributor, you know, to the formation of society, all of us are of value, and it's important for us to make sure that that everyone's voice is counted in the historical narrative. The second Christian belief, the reality of sin. It may seem very obvious, but you know, we've seen, and we probably ourselves have fallen into the trap of hero worship. But once we come to grips with human nature and our sinful nature, we realize there are no heroes in history. There are people that have acted heroically. You know, just go and use one scripture reference, 1 John 1:8. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. We're all tainted by sin, and we are all very susceptible to acting in ways that prefer ourselves over others, and frankly, even over God. You know, if you really get into a study of the past, it's you know, we can really kind of be shamed by the past, and it's, you know, we see on full display the horrendous atrocities that have gone before us and that we as humans are capable of. And I think our response to that ought to be, there but by the grace of God go I. And so I think the reality of sin adds an important perspective as we study the past. And when we think about the incarnation, the incarnate approach, again, John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word, God became flesh and lived among us. All things came into being through Him, and without Him, not one thing came into being. And if we adopt this mindset, if we embrace this perspective, you know, we're reminded that you know, God makes possible the study of humans in all of their interactions, because it is God become flesh, the reality of Jesus Christ, that sustains the world and that's all, and all that is in it. He and others go so far as to say failure to respect the people of the past is ultimately a failure of love. It's a failure to recognize the common bond that we share with humanity. But once again, I think all of this leads us to maybe empathy first, but very quickly humility. And then the fourth point, this notion of morality and moral reflection. And Chris, I appreciate you raising that issue. You know, and I do think that you know, we've got to very carefully and cautiously call it like we see it. But you know, it's one historian made the statement that we need to work hard to avoid the temptation to trade history for moral criticism. You know, in one article I read, they were talking about the institution of slavery, and clearly that is morally wrong. But this person said, you know, let's not just go to the Bible or other religious teaching. As a historian, let's make the case. Let's make the case of those atrocities. Let's use evidence to show the brutality of that even led to death in many cases. But my big takeaway from all of this is that, well, you go look at John chapter 8, verse 7. Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And so I think that there is a place for moral reflection, maybe in rare cases, moral criticism. But again, we should be very cautious as we approach that. So I'm curious to get some feedback now, and I can go back. I'll keep those beliefs up. But I'm curious, from your perspective, how these beliefs applied to the study of the past help us work toward a more civil society and maybe even a more compassionate Christian faith. And then also, where have you seen examples of this? Where have you seen examples where we see some civility and we see more compassion as believers as a result of maybe a different perspective on how we look at the past and the study of history?
And can you put the question slide back for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Kent. This is Melissa.
Hey.
So Ben and I are kind of having a side conversation over here about the difference between history, learning history, studying history, and activism. Because activism feels, you know, at times more urgent and can't take it. This wasn't the conversation we were having, but feels more urgent and can't take the time to go back and study history. So I guess I'm wondering where that fits in.
Yeah, a couple of things, Melissa. This is frankly where I have really been living since the end of May, since the murder of George Floyd and the social uprising, and many in our organization, a number of our younger staff have really been challenging us as an organization to take a more activist role. And you know, we feel like the primary role of an organization like MNHS in those situations is to aggressively provide historical context so that people can fully, you know, can, to the extent possible, understand how we got to this point, that this didn't just happen. You know, there are all kinds of things that led to this moment. But that we, as an organization, you know, maybe stop short of kind of leading the charge with regard to social change. It's really interesting. I go back to Thea, and he talks about this experience that he went through several years ago at Messiah College, where they had to fill out the survey, and the faculty would wind up in one of 4 different categories. And and one of them was an activist, and he was shocked to find out that he clearly, based on his responses, wound up in that activist category. And so I think a lot of us in history are realizing, you know, we can't be neutral. That's a myth. And because of what we have learned individually or collectively, particularly as believers, we are called to take action. And so he's kind of living into this historian slash activist role, and he's really challenging his students, you know, particularly when you add that Christian dimension, you know, to embrace that role of activist. But at least in his case, it's not it's not a pass to not do the work as a scholar and to you know, to the best of his ability, understand all that, you know, led us to this point, and then hopefully makes it quite clear what those next steps need to be for a more civil society and a more compassionate Christian. So yeah, there's a very natural, I think, intersection, even a tension, and so I think that there's some overlap, but I think you know, pure activism is a little bit different function, but relates to, you know, the role of a historian.
And a follow-up question: can activism actually be misguided without a more robust understanding of history?
Well, admitting my bias, I would say absolutely yes, and I would, and that's been an awful lot of why I feel so strongly about the role. And I'll go back to MNHS, the role that MNHS needs to play in this moment. And if we get, if not us, then who? And so we need to do what we're best equipped to do, but we contribute to, you know, what we hope is that move toward a more just society. So yeah, absolutely. I think that some activists be misguided, and I would argue that if organizations like ours are diligent and focused, then maybe we help minimize that from happening.
Yeah, Kent, I really appreciate the question and your response to it. Tailgating with that, you know, should the church lead the charge? You know, it's a really a key question today. And you talk about the primary role of historian and leading the charge, and then from my perspective, the primary purpose of the church, but also how do you become active, involved? There's such a wide variety of understanding with it. It's a crucial question.
Well, and Tom, I think that you and Melissa just, you know, absolutely hit on why the church needs history lessons. You know, we need to approach our understanding of the past again with those traits that we've talked about, and I think a lot of times, frankly, the church has been quick to embrace a very Eurocentric, almost kind of heroic, you know, interpretation of American history, and that, as we've seen over and over, does not align necessarily with a more just and civil society. In fact, you know, it's unfortunately, I think we've all seen over and over that their understanding of the past is actually drawn battle lines, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah.
And there's a question on the chat that's close to what I was thinking too. How do we, there has to be some moral criticism that comes into our looking at things in the past. I really, really appreciate your comment about compassion. Hopefully we view the characters in the past with the same kind of compassion as we view our neighbors. But thinking like a person like Thomas Jefferson that's tended to be lauded, but still there's so many things reprehensible in his behavior as a slave owner and somebody who actually arguably promoted the expansion of slavery in the US. Where does some of the moral issues come in when you're presenting the characters that have so much good and bad in there?
So I think Chris, what you got to do is present them as human beings that have sinned like the rest of us, and you know, and let their positive contributions and their moral failings, you know, rest there side by side. I mean, that's that's the story of any of us and all of us. You know, I think we've got to call it like we see it, but we sure better ground all that in solid evidence. And I think you know, but I think Jefferson is a perfect example of the complexity and the messiness of the past. And well, you know, it's let me move ahead. There's another a quote I'd like to share. I'll come back to that one. I'll come back to Chris and Mark.
Hey, while you're looking for that, can I just remind people to mute everybody? If you could mute while you're not talking, it'd be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, here's the slide I was looking for. You know, again, so many people feel like revisionist history is an attempt to kind of tear down America and American history. And Marsden here says it's actually a sign of maturity when representatives of a group can write a history that takes into account that we're flawed human beings. And the protagonists are just like everyone else. And in the long run, these are way more convincing histories than this hero narrative that so many of us are familiar with. So, you know, and I've thought about there was a line in the United States Poet Laureate's poem at the inauguration and I didn't get the right phrasing, but it was, you know, the idea as I remember it was we continue to work at this and to learn more and to understand more fully, because, you know, this is an act of love for our country. You know, this is not an act of trying to destroy our country. It's quite the opposite. So, you know, to me, this is that notion of letting those moments that make us proud as Americans be acknowledged, but let those sit right beside the other realities that aren't as quite as well known. You know, another example for me is Abraham Lincoln. You know, and being a Kentuckian, his home state, and being at KHS, at the Kentucky Historical Society, during the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth, and we were just very adamant about getting that story out, the Kentucky story of Lincoln. And it was fascinating. As I moved to Minnesota, frankly, I was introduced more fully to the impact of Lincoln's policies and his decisions on the Native American community. You know, think about the largest mass killing and mass hanging in American history at Mankato, the 38, and then the other two that were hung at Fort Snelling. Or you look at what happened to the Native Americans through the Morrill Act and things like that. And so, you know, here I am, someone who spent a fair amount of their career studying Lincoln and trying to broaden the story, but unintentionally, but consistently not bringing to light the story of the Native Americans and how they view Lincoln. So there's complexity and messiness everywhere you turn. So I'd like to go back and take a look at a couple of other observations about these characteristics. And I was struck, I read the Pietist Option last year, and so appreciated in this chapter that Mark wrote. Fear, greed, ethnic and racial divisions, nationalism, all of this more tempts us to move away from rather than toward each other. The impulse to distrust, to dismiss, and to divide is as present in the church as elsewhere. Jesus calls us to make a countercultural move, to walk with him in love toward one another in the church and toward our neighbors beyond. And so I thought that was beautifully aligned with so many of the things that I've been reading as I was preparing for these conversations. And then I find it reassuring, not surprising anymore, but very reassuring that this aligns well with some of the latest thinking and scholarship on the teaching of the past, what's often called historical thinking. And so I'll let you read that. And notice the reference to theology. Ben, I thought of you. But this is a historian at Stanford. You know, in some respects, it sounds an awful lot like what Mark wrote in the Pietist Option. Any thoughts or reactions to that statement by Sam Weinberg?
I keep thinking that there are some of us that, when I say us, I mean like humanity, that just desperately don't trust their own sense. And so they need to have a way to plug into some kind of moral goodness and use the church to do that. And they don't want to look at anything that would, it's like that need for simplicity overrides maybe it's not even a need for simplicity, but for understanding and wanting to be in the right and sort of that justification that goes along with that. And I think you can excuse a lot of evil if you feel like the ultimate expression of whatever it is the train that you're on is the good way.
Right, so. Right. Well, and yeah, but I frankly, I agree with what you're saying, and I find it heartbreaking that any of our faiths would be that fragile. You know, I mean, it's so liberating to know that we can pursue all truth and know that wherever that takes us, we're going to find God. And yet, I think, you know, again, it's so sad when people, you know, don't trust that and feel like they've got to construct this very flimsy, you know, understanding of the past and ultimately maybe our faith. I mean, it's but I think you're right. There's that need to be right. And one of the things I loved about Mark's, actually, I take that back. It's a different quote from, here we go. This ministry of listening that Mark and Chris talk about in the Pietist Option, you know, that we should be less eager to win an argument and desire far more to sustain a relationship. You know, and of course, Bonhoeffer we have to work that in, but that whole notion of listening. He not only gives us his word, but also lends us his ear. And so it is his work that we do for our brother. When we listen, when we learn to listen, I'm afraid that would be somewhat terrifying to some of the folks who really want to simplify things and want the narrative they've always known, where there were clear good guys and clear bad guys, and there was I can't remember now the name, but there was a philosopher from the 16th century that somebody referenced in something I was reading that says, we are quick to call evil that what we don't understand. And I think, it's just even more heartbreaking that the church, that we in the church fall into that trap sometimes. When if we would work to understand rather than be so quick to label something that is foreign to us as evil. So I see we're at 10:50. So let me wrap up with Kirk. I had a little about intellectual hospitality based on our back and forth earlier in the week, but I think what I'm going to do though is sorry about that. I'm looking for this one, the call for Christian historians. So what is it we can do to work at maybe eliminating at some point the culture wars or toning down the shouting matches. And Robert Tracy McKenzie is now the chair of the history department at Wheaton College, a well-respected historian at the University of Washington. And he chose to leave that full tenured position and go to a Christian college because he felt so strongly about his role as a Christian historian. And he calls us to do a couple, several things that are pretty obvious, but just because they're obvious doesn't mean they're easy. What are those barriers and how do we break those down? Those of us that study history, either professionally or otherwise, because I think we've identified in this conversation what some of those barriers are. But we've got to work at those now that we've identified them. One of the things we can do is we can find some common ground with fellow Christians by affirming what they already know about the past. And that may take some work too, because frankly, there's a lot of bad material out there being passed off is historical scholarship by Christians. But I think it's worth the effort for us to find common ground and see if we can't connect, at least initially, around maybe a shared understanding about part of the past. And it's easy for me to pull up these quotes about listening and sustaining a relationship and not being right all the time. But then I'm really convicted when I see this third call. We've got to present this in an accessible way, and we've got to do it, without intentionally provoking people. And I'll be honest with you, there are times I just get really frustrated and kind of fed up. And I may not be the scholar, but I can find one who can make the case, and I want to bring that out, and I want to, and I want to provoke sort of an antagonistic discussion, and that doesn't do any of us any good. And so anyway, I hope that you guys will take that call to heart, that there are things that all of us can do. Clearly, all of you have a genuine interest in history and the study of the past. I hope we all will adopt a ministry of listening. And I mentioned it last week, but I got to wind up with the prayer of St. Francis, and particularly in that that second verse, "O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek," and I'll jump down to be understood as to understand. You know, I think that is at the heart of all of this. And so I just hope and pray that those of us that call ourselves Christians, and that those of us that are in some way or another, you know, stewards of the study of history, we'll think about those traits, and we'll be about breaking down barriers, and be about maybe helping to bring an end to these very intense, destructive culture wars.
Say, Tom, Kent, thank you